When you compare China and America, both countries benefited tremendously from globalization. If you look at GDP growth, look at surpluses, they've all gained large amounts of wealth. But here's where things get strange. China's GDP grew 10 times, and China's median income grew about 8 times. In America, the GDP also grew tremendously, 4 or 5 times from a much larger base. Yet their median income has been stagnant and dropping. Where has the money gone? Go to Paris, walk the streets on any weekend, and you'll see people wearing yellow vests who will tell you exactly where their money has gone. Even in Germany, the most successful country in Europe, there's tremendous dissatisfaction. We're witnessing a massive backlash against the elites who led this wave of globalization, and it will only intensify and spread. But China has been the only exception among all major countries in the world. China was the only one who engaged globalization and benefited from it the most, yet it rejected globalism decisively. It said no to the political system of liberal democracy. It said no to market capitalism. It was pointedly not market capitalism. It's socialism with Chinese characteristics, which is fundamentally different. Some form of market economy exists, but not capitalism. How do you distinguish them? In a capitalist society, capital is an independent power. Capital can determine the future of a country. In China, in a socialist country, there's tremendous capital, great entrepreneurs, lots of wealth, but capital is beneath political authority. The national political authority will never allow capital to determine the future of the country. Think about it this way. In America, the 100 wealthiest people will have an outsized influence on the future of the American political establishment and the direction of the country. In China, the 100 or 500 wealthiest Chinese people will have zero influence over the Politburo and the Central Committee. Zero. That's the difference between a capitalist country and a socialist country. The role of capital is borderless. Capital is not committed to the land. Capital is not committed to culture. Capital goes wherever it can make the most money. That's why you see all these backlashes in developed countries and developing countries alike, because people want their lives taken care of. They don't want to just be ruled by capital. China is the only country that's been successful in this globalization process. It developed a tremendous economy, became the second largest economy by nominal terms and largest by PPP. It's now the largest trading nation in the world by far, and the largest trading nation in history. 115 or 120 countries count China as their largest trading partner. Only 63 count the US as their largest trading partner. China has done this and lifted 800 million people out of poverty in the process, and it's continuing on that journey. Now, something unprecedented is happening in the world. The United States and its Western allies, confronted with these problems of globalization, seem to have decided to lead an effort to deconstruct and destroy the institutions of globalism that it built. It's never happened in the history of conflicts. Graham Allison, author of the book about great power conflicts, confirmed he had never seen an instance like this. The leading power, the incumbent leading power, is dismantling the system it built by itself for its benefit. It wants to ditch it. And of course, you have all those other countries, especially in Europe, that built their systems based on the belief the US-led system would continue forever for another 2,000 years. They're in trouble now. What is China proposing? Look at 16+1 or 17+1. Look at Belt and Road Initiative. China is proposing a new form of globalization, a globalization that's liberated from the ideological shackles of liberalism, a globalization that's non-ideological. A globalization that allows space for countries to develop their own paths, that does not seek to impose a set of political or economic values onto other countries. A globalization that respects national sovereignty. It respects differences. A globalization of diversity or pluralism. President Xi Jinping used to say that it's like a pair of shoes. Whether or not they fit, only you could tell when you walk. The Chinese approach is making a difference in the world. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, through 17+1, through other initiatives, China's proposition is still nascent, still new. There will be problems and issues, but it's a new idea the world should entertain. The goal is to promote interconnectivity, promote globalization, but respect cultural and civilizational integrity, respect national sovereignty, and let each country discover and pursue their own development paths. The current U.S. leadership wants to draw down an iron curtain to decouple with China and other economies too. The U.S. has great advantage and strength to compete and win in an era of what could be called warring states, a period in Chinese history where everybody fights for its own interests. But that will be an unsettling and risky period. We ought to be looking to reconstruct a more peaceful world order, and China's proposal needs to be heard. China has learned one lesson in the last 40 years. It went from an agrarian poor country into a behemoth. There's one lesson they learned. If you want to get rich, build a road. Infrastructure-led development, not just physical infrastructure, but digital infrastructure as well. China is trying to take that idea and use its excess capital, excess capacity to build infrastructure in countries connected to the Chinese economy to increase interconnectivity. That's what the Belt and Road is about. 5 or 6 years ago, terminals were built in Chongqing, and now there are direct routes straight to Madrid and London. Along the route, it will improve trade, improve investment environments, and hopefully bring development and prosperity in those countries. And it will come back and benefit China, but it's up to those countries to decide how they want to do it and how they want to run their countries, their politics, and their economy. Take Malaysia as an example. China had big projects in Malaysia with big financing and borrowing, and they changed government. Prime Minister Mahathir came to power and said some of those deals were not good deals for Malaysia, so they renegotiated. China cut the price by a third and changed certain aspects of the transaction, and they're back on track. The Chinese are saying you decide how you want to run your country. You're a sovereign power, and we're not going to impose our standards on you. For as long as anyone can remember, since the early 1990s, every 10 years or so, there's been some major crisis that was going to sink China. The troubles are real. In the early 1990s, those post-1989 years were difficult. Everybody said the Chinese economy would buckle under the sanctions. But China survived and powered through. Then there was the Asian financial crisis. Then there were the reforms. The real estate bubble burst. These days, there's a serious problem with youth unemployment, but during those reforms, everybody knew someone who was unemployed. Every family felt like somebody lost their job in Shanghai and up in the Northeast. All the troubles are real, but the rest is history. Look back at Xi Jinping's tenure starting in 2012, 10 years ago. What were the serious troubles that were going to kill China, that were going to end the Chinese experiment? If you were a journalist at that time, you would remember writing about them. Official corruption, economic inequality, and environmental degradation. 3 major problems, major crises that were going to kill the country, that were going to end the Chinese project. Hu Jintao, the General Party Secretary at the time, said himself that failing to handle corruption was going to end the party and the state publicly. The New York Times was reporting on corruption every day, saying this corruption was the DNA of the party state, so they could never fix it. Nobody had ever seen an anti-corruption campaign like this one. A famous historian and writer in China wrote that this was the most intense anti-corruption movement in 2,000 years. Nobody had ever seen anything like it. The outcome? Not there yet. There's still corruption. But everybody on the ground will tell you it's much better. If you look at the data, the Edelman Trust Barometer measuring trust in governance and social institutions shows that in the last 10 years, the US and China have diverged. The US is dropping like a rock, and China is moving up. Second challenge, economic inequality. There were 20 to 30 years of breakneck growth, 10 to 20 to 30 years of market ruling everything. The result was tremendous growth, but the byproduct was a few got really, really rich and the rest are better off than before. But the gap widened tremendously. China created more billionaires than any other country in that period. Think about that. A socialist country, and the Gini coefficient surged over 0.4. If you study politics, you know this is revolution business, dangerous territory. Everybody thought this would be an intractable problem because the greatest country since the birth of mankind, the United States of America, could not fix that problem. The best political system, liberal democracy, could not fix that problem. So of course, China was dead in the water, couldn't fix inequality, was going to have revolutions. But there were tremendous government initiatives to fix poverty. In the last 10 years during Xi's first and second term, they lifted nearly 100 million people in the last 5 years out of absolute poverty. The baseline is pretty low, but they lifted that 100 million people out of absolute poverty. It was a tremendous project. Many people died on the front line. Communist Party cadres died, gave their lives, thousands, because the conditions were treacherous in those rural areas. It's never happened in Chinese history. The Chinese Communist Party, under the leadership of Xi Jinping in the last 10 years, had lifted more people out of absolute poverty than any other country in history. And bear in mind, this is the last 100 million, which is always the hardest. It's easier when you're really poor to lift the first group, second batch, third batch. This is the very last batch of people living in absolute poverty. The Common Prosperity Initiative represents a paradigm shift in China's development model. The Gini coefficient is improving, though not there yet. It's a scandal that China is the only major economy in the world that does not have an inheritance tax, does not have a property tax, and does not have a capital gains tax. Think about that. A socialist country. Third challenge, environmental degradation. If you go back to 2012, if you were reporting about China, you were probably writing about PM 2.5 every day. This was going to lead to revolutions. Nobody talks about PM 2.5 anymore. If you go to Beijing, it's blue sky most days. Globally, China has been a leader in dealing with climate change with the Paris Accord. And China in the last 10 years has become a global leader in green technologies. Number 1. These 3 major challenges, these 3 major crises that were going to stop China's development have not been totally resolved, but achieved tremendous successes. What needs to happen now? China needs to move from the old paradigm to a new paradigm to make more money out of its existing economy and develop new industries. Otherwise, it will be stuck in the so-called middle-income trap. Look at 2 new directions. First, existing industrial capacity. China's industrial capacity is about 33 to 35% of the world's, bigger than the US, Japan, Germany, and India put together. But the value add of that industrial capacity is still relatively low, about 12%. It's like the gross margin of industrial capacity is 12%. When the US in the 1970s was at the height of their industrial capacity, their gross margin was about 35 to 40%. China's industrial capacity is worth about 5 to 10 trillion US dollars a year. To go from 12% to 35 to 40%, think about how big the pie is. Maybe 8 to 10 points is semiconductor. Second, new industries driven by technology innovation, alternative energy, new materials, bioengineering, life sciences. China is doing great in these areas. The political leadership had concluded the market forces could not be relied upon to engineer this transition. This had to be done through political initiatives, top-down. As a venture capitalist, there was recognition that capital wasn't going in those directions. There's a gross misallocation of capital, market misallocation of capital, that's being reallocated by political initiatives, by policies. Then we'll see if the market catches up. This is what's happening in the Chinese economy now, and it's in a difficult period. Antonio Gramsci, the Italian communist, said that the old is dying, but the new is struggling to be born, and we're in the interregnum. This is what the Chinese economy is now, and this period is expected to last 2, 3, or 4 years. But this is the tough period to go through to get to the next stage. The trade war needs to be understood in the context of a larger-scale competition between these 2 countries, and there will be more competition not just between China and the US, but among many other countries like Russia and Germany. We're in a new era where somehow Europeans in particular had this thought that turned out to be an illusion, that somehow we're going to build this so-called liberal rules-based international order where everybody will operate under certain sets of rules. That's over. Now it's an era where everybody competes, everybody fights, and there's not going to be a set of rules that countries respect. We're going to see an era of hard power, unfortunately, not because of choice, but because of the failure of the soft power era. The rules-based system didn't deliver for the people. Will China's model of non-ideological globalization succeed where Western liberalism has stumbled? Can a system that prioritizes political authority over capital truly deliver prosperity without sacrificing freedom? The world is watching this unprecedented experiment unfold. Subscribe to follow this story as it develops, because understanding these competing visions isn't just academic. It's essential for navigating the future we're all heading into.